Hello everyone, and welcome to this special episode of Translationborne, where we'll be running around the Lower Loran Chalice dungeon while examining some key regional differences to be found in Bloodborne. Of course, there are many reasons why the experience you have playing the game might be different depending on where you live and what languages you speak. Most Japanese players, for instance, will by default hear dialogue in a foreign language they don't fully understand, while that simply won't be the case for native English speakers. Recreating this aspect of the game for someone like me would require using the dub for another foreign language, like Italian.
Oh, sì, il sangue smonto. Bene, hai raggiunto il luogo giusto. Yarnam è la sede dell'infusione del sangue.
But this sort of difference is perhaps less surprising than another set of regional changes in the game, which is that Bloodborne uses different text for many of its item descriptions in British English as opposed to American English. So what exactly are these differences, and how do they relate to the Japanese version of the game? Well, that's what this special episode of Translationborne is all about. We're going to go through all of the items singled out in the Bloodborne Lore Translation Guide as having changes more significant than spelling alterations and see how they compare to their Japanese equivalents. To streamline the process, we'll also be grouping items together into a few broad categories. The first and largest of these categories involves items that were likely changed as part of the regular process of localization. There are aspects of British English that are different from American English besides spelling, and it only makes sense that the text would be altered to appeal to players in a given region. However, not all of these changes are so straightforward. Some seem instead to be related to an esoteric aspect of how the game works, and the most complex and confusing discrepancies all seem to be tied up with the continued updates made to the Japanese text. Taken together, all this adds up to a case where neither English release is truly definitive compared to the Japanese. Before we get into some of the more negative aspects of this, though, I want to begin with some examples of how this lack of a definitive version can be a positive. The clearest of these cases involve decisions made for the purposes of localization, where things such as the presentation of information or the grammatical style are changed to be more in line with a given culture's expectations. Bloodborne has a number of items that were almost certainly altered for these reasons, though there are a few more arguable cases as well. Even in these more debatable instances, though, I think the variation still works as a positive in appealing to some players more than others. This is, after all, part of how localization works. When players in different parts of the world prefer different methods of presenting information, altering the game's presentation to appeal to each region's preferences can be a good thing. In Bloodborne, one of the easiest places to see this in action is in the description of any item intended to be used online, because each version of the game has a different way of demarcating the transition between lore-relevant item text and real-world game mechanics. In Japanese, this is done with a symbol not commonly used in English that looks like a fancy asterisk. In the US version of the game, the word note is used here, while in UK English, the abbreviation NB is shown instead. Obviously, there's not a lot of lore significance to these changes, but as I said earlier, I think this serves as a good example of the localization process at work. While the Japanese symbol might be comprehensible in North America or the broader English-speaking world, it's not the most natural way of signaling the shift to addressing the player, whereas note makes perfect sense to my US-based sensibilities. Similarly, while I understand what NB means, I don't run across it in everyday usage very often, but that's presumably the more natural phrasing to English speakers in places like Australia or Great Britain. In other words, even though we're seeing three different approaches to identifying this aside to the player, each one makes sense in its respective region. It's not just how this symbol was treated, though. These sorts of localization differences show up in the stylistic handling of certain phrases as well, with the UK English version of the game apparently favoring more formally acceptable sentence structures. In the Yarnum Hunter set, for example, the US item description begins its final section with the word but. Of course, it's a generally accepted piece of stylistic advice that beginning sentences with conjunctions like but or and is less than ideal, and perhaps as a result, the British English version rephrases this sentence to better align with this sort of advice. In fact, we can see the same stylistic change in the final section of the description for the Rakuyo, only this time there's not even a need for the British English version to include a mid-sentence reversal like though, because the basic information that one day Maria abandoned the weapon is strong enough on its own. Now, technically speaking, the US English versions of these descriptions are a bit closer to the Japanese, since each one begins with a word like although or but in the original. Still, I don't think that's an important consideration when it comes to these sorts of stylistic reformulations. Whatever sounds better to the local target audience is the version that should be used. More debatable are some of the other changes to be found in that final section of the Rakuyo, with the addition of a comma after the words dark well, and the alteration of stomach its presence to stomach it. Of course, the latter of those changes may have been made to save space and better preserve line breaks, but even if it wasn't, the shortening of the line by the removal of an extra word can be considered in line with good style. Actually, if we want an example of a case where a discrepancy seems to exist solely because of a differing stylistic preference, we need look no further than the canon. The central portion of the US English version of this item description reads, "Use of this weapon is equivalent to toting a mounted cannon, complete with its ridiculous weight, staggering kick, and lavish use of quicksilver bullets, into battle." Here, the core of the sentence is extremely straightforward. Use of this weapon is equivalent to toting a mounted cannon into battle. However, it's made longer and more complex by breaking up that simple idea with examples of what it actually means to tote a cannon into battle: the weight, kick, and high demand for bullets. Of course, it all works grammatically because the commas are appropriately placed to set off this subset of important information. But this kind of sentence formulation comes at a cost. Breaking up the core idea makes the sentence as a whole harder to parse, because readers need to remember that the phrase "into battle" at the end is the conclusion of "use of this weapon is equivalent to toting a mounted cannon" at the beginning. So what if there was a stylistic preference for making sentences easier to follow? Well, we can see what that would look like here on the British English version of the description. Use of this weapon is equivalent to toting a mounted cannon into battle, complete with its ridiculous weight, staggering kick, and lavish use of quicksilver bullets. Simply by moving the phrase "into battle" earlier in the sentence, the core idea of toting a cannon into battle is completed before elaborating on what that entails. This reduces the sentence complexity while still containing all of the relevant information. Furthermore, as I mentioned earlier, none of this is even an issue for the Japanese, because there is no literal equivalent of that "into battle" phrase in the original. In other words, which version is more appropriate in English is solely an issue of English language style. I'm actually kind of torn on this one myself, because while in general I prefer the more streamlined style of the British English, on this item I like how the more complex phrasing of the American English mirrors the clunky nature of the weapon itself. Before we finish with the topic of stylistic variation, though, I want to look at a more ambiguous case, where even though the UK English wording is arguably more in line with good style and closer to the Japanese, I find the US English approach more appealing. This may or may not have been the result of localization changes, but I think it still functions as an example of how certain sentence formulations may work better for one group of readers than another. The example I'm thinking of involves the difference of only a single word, but personally I think it makes for a noticeable change in tone. There's a line towards the end of the description for the blood of Ariana which explains that her blood is similar to what was once forbidden, and here the North American version of the item includes the word "indeed" along with a comma. Now, as I mentioned when discussing the final section of the Rakuyo, common stylistic advice is to eliminate unnecessary words to strengthen a sentence, so I can see why this might have been cut, but I like the extra emphasis this particular word adds, as well as the pause that the comma brings. Her blood is similar indeed to precisely what was once forbidden. It just has an extra weight to it in my mind. I can imagine a dramatic, revelatory delivery for it much more easily than with the succinct "her blood is similar to precisely what was once forbidden." So even if the UK English version is more concise and closer to the Japanese, I actually prefer the North American text. But despite my personal preferences, you can make stylistic arguments for favoring the UK English version of this item, just as you could with any of the stylistic choices I mentioned earlier. Like the regional variations in communicating to players that certain items will only function online, these are changes that could seem more natural in one part of the world rather than another. As a result, I think they deserve to be listed as additional examples of how sometimes changing the text of a game for one group of English speakers as opposed to another can be a good thing. Of course, not every example of variation from region to region can be seen as a positive. There's one item on the list that seems to have had its translation reinterpreted from the Japanese for the US English version of the game. This may have been done as part of the localization process, but given the nature of what's changed, I'm not actually sure if that's the case. The item in question here is the Grey Wolf cap, and while the differences between the British and American English translations are small, I want to look at them in detail because depending on how you interpret which parts of the Japanese sentence are modifying others, either version could make sense to me. In North America, this piece of attire is described as a worn wolf cap, which comes from interpreting the Japanese for worn or frayed, sasakureta, as applying to the phrase okami no boshi, or wolf cap. However, if you think the term okami in the phrase okami no boshi is referring to dura, not acting as a modifier for the term hat or cap, you'll arrive at a different meaning. By this reading, the understanding would be that the cap worn by the wolf, or dura, is old and beaten up. As it happens, this separation of the term wolf from the description of the cap lines up reasonably well with the existing UK English translation for the item. This worn cap was the lone wolf's trademark. Either version could make sense here, and again, while I could see these changes being made during the localization process, it feels more like a reinterpretation to me than anything. In fact, it's possible that the reason the Grey Wolf cap got revisited in the North American release was because of the discovery of another issue with these sets of attire. This is something that affects many different clothing sets, and leads us into the second category of discrepancies I described earlier, those tied to a relatively esoteric aspect of the game, which is the somewhat hidden distinctions Bloodborne makes for female as opposed to male player characters. I say somewhat hidden because while these differences aren't that hard to spot when playing the game, they could certainly be a challenge for a translator. For example, in Japanese, the name of what's literally the church's black leg piece could refer to what in the game might be either a pair of pants or a dress. This means that without a visual reference to differentiate these two items, the same term could also be used for both in English, despite each name referring to a different kind of legwear. This seems to be what happened with the UK English sets of attire. For whatever reason, though, this is not the case in the North American version of the game. Here, the three leg pieces that change in this way have both the word trousers and the word dress in their item names. Furthermore, note that the knight's trousers/dress also includes a slight change to its description. While the UK English version of the knight's leg piece opens by identifying the item as trousers of the Knights of Canehurst, the US English uses the more generic term attire, just like on the torso piece. Now, I can't say for sure why this happened. It may just be the result of accidentally reusing the opening for the knight's garb, but I do think it's possible that the return to the more generic word attire in the North American release may have been a way to deal with a unified description for an item with two different names. Since this piece could be identified as either the knight's trousers or the knight's dress, referring to it simply as a piece of attire in a joint description avoids the issue of settling on either the male or female specific term, which could be rendered incorrect based on the player's choice in character creation. Whatever the reason behind this specific wording, though, the translation of these variable sets of attire shows how the broad flexibility of the term leg piece in the Japanese can be misleading when combined with the gender-specific nature of the sets themselves. This is one way in which decisions made in development seem to have impacted the translation, though thankfully the end result is relatively minor. However, there's another way in which the development process appears to have created issues in translation, and it's in this third category of discrepancies, those due to the continued updating of the Japanese text, where the biggest problems can be found. This sort of developmental issue would be significant even if it only meant that one version of the game was less up to date than the other, but as we'll see, the way things have been implemented into the latest versions of the game are even more confusing. That's because, while in general the UK English text seems to have been based on more recent Japanese than the US English, there are a couple of important cases where the North American release is actually closer to the original. What's more, while some of the game's patches have helped improve things, both English language versions of the game have also had discrepancies introduced by updates, including one item that appears to have both gotten better and worse. Clearly, this makes for a complex topic, so I want to start off by establishing a baseline for how the UK English version of the game is generally more in line with the latest Japanese. Now, there are a lot of items we can look at for evidence of this, so I've once again decided to group them into broad categories based on how these changes affect a player's experience of the game. First, the British English text arguably does a better job of guiding players to different locations. Second, several items are missing useful gameplay information from their full descriptions in the American English release. Third and finally, the British English text is more consistent with the lore found in some parts of the Japanese, though the North American release does have some advantages of its own on this point. Actually, even when it comes to the first point I mentioned about how the game helps guide players, the US English text isn't without its upsides, and in the case of one group of items, it's halfway up to date. As longtime viewers may recall, there is perhaps no clearer evidence of how the game's Japanese text must have been updated over time than can be found in the North American version's mismatched text between Ludwig's rifle and Ludwig's holy blade. In Japanese, the final paragraph used for each of these items is identical, consisting of an explanation of how Ludwig moved the Healing Church workshop away from Gehrman's techniques. For players with a North American copy of the game, though, this is not the case. In US English, the description for Ludwig's holy blade matches up perfectly with the Japanese, but the final section of Ludwig's rifle is different, including no direct mention of Gehrman's techniques or the Healing Church workshop. This suggests to me that at one point, the proper translation for both Ludwig's rifle and Ludwig's holy blade was the version that can still be found on the North American release of Ludwig's rifle. Then, after the Japanese text was updated, the US version of the game used the new translation on Ludwig's holy blade, but for whatever reason, Ludwig's rifle was overlooked. In fact, there's further evidence of this to be found in version 1.00 of the game. Apparently, before the game was patched, the US English description for the lost and uncanny variants of Ludwig's holy blade ended with text nearly identical to the North American version of Ludwig's rifle. In other words, we can actually see the US English translation getting updated to better match what's almost certainly newer Japanese text across all versions of Ludwig's holy blade. But there's a reason I've been focusing on this sequence using the North American version of the game. That's because the British English item descriptions for both Ludwig's holy blade and Ludwig's rifle have always matched the Japanese ones. Back in Bloodborne 1.00, the UK English text on the lost and uncanny versions of Ludwig's holy blade apparently didn't need to be changed. This shows that the US English text was less up to date than the Japanese and the UK English translation going back to version 1.00. But how does this fit into the category of game guidance? Well, recall that the older text on Ludwig's rifle makes no reference to the Healing Church workshop. This is an optional area that you're meant to be able to find, and its existence is hinted at in a number of church weapon descriptions. The Kirkhammer, for instance, is even clearer about how to reach this location, though only the Japanese text fully makes sense in the latest version of the game. This fact, combined with a surprising update to the North American release, makes the Kirkhammer one of the most interesting items to examine in this context. So, how is it different from region to region? Well, if we look at the last section of the Kirkhammer's description, we can see that the US English text involves an observation about the symbolic nature of the weapon. In British English, this is instead a direct reference to the hidden Healing Church workshop, which is much closer to the current Japanese description except for one detail. The Japanese suggests that the Healing Church workshop was hidden somewhere in the Cathedral Ward, Seidogai, while the UK English version instead hints at it being in the Grand Cathedral. In other words, the Japanese points players right to where the Healing Church workshop actually is, while the British English translation provides evidence of its existence but gets the location wrong. Meanwhile, the American English text doesn't even mention it. Strangely, though, it seems like part of the reason this reference is absent from the US English translation is that it was removed. Apparently, back in version 1.00 of the game, the North American release included two different translations for the final lines of the Kirkhammer. The standard version of the weapon ended with the same observation as to its symbolic nature, while the lost and uncanny varieties instead concluded with the message hinting at the existence of the Healing Church workshop. Obviously, this sort of internal discrepancy was less than ideal, so when the game was patched, the North American version of the game unified the translation. The problem is, it was the less accurate text on the standard version of the weapon that was used to replace the lost and uncanny variants, rather than the other way around. It's an update that introduced further discrepancies into the US English translation. By contrast, the UK English version of the game seems to have always used the same, more accurate translation for all versions of the Kirkhammer. Now, there is still the difference in location between the British English and the Japanese to consider, which could have been the result of a simple mistake, but it's also possible that the Japanese text received a further update than even the UK English, and we'll see more evidence of this later. For now, though, the important thing is that this is another instance where the British English text appears to have been more up-to-date than the North American release, even if at one point some of the US English versions of the Kirkhammer used the same translation. That brings us to the final example of an item where the British English text is better at directing players along the main path than the American English, and this time that statement needs no qualification. The relevant text here can be found in the final section of the item description for the gold pendant, and this is another discrepancy that seems to be the result of an update to the Japanese, because here the US English text refers to the adage of the Healing Church as words that will open the gates of Byrgenwerth. In the game as it exists now, Byrgenwerth's gates don't need opening. What we have to do instead is use the adage as the password to be allowed into the Forbidden Woods. For players outside of North America, though, this idea of using the phrase to open Byrgenwerth's gates is abandoned entirely. Instead, the item description ends by letting players know that in order to learn the adage, they must touch the skull on the altar of the Grand Cathedral. This matches up with the Japanese, and together with a note that can be found spelling out that the adage of the Healing Church is the password that will allow entry into the Forbidden Woods, it ends up sending a much clearer message of how to actually progress in the current version of the game. This sort of improved guidance, not only in hinting at side areas like the Healing Church workshop, but also explaining how to make necessary progress through the game, helps the British English version hold together just that much better than the American English one. This is something we can also see in the text of many Carol runes, though the ways in which these more up-to-date translations impact players don't have anything to do with guidance. Instead, these discrepancies add gameplay functionality and change some of the implications about the game's lore. Since both of these changes can be found on the Deep Sea runes, let's start by looking at these from a functional point of view. The purpose of this entire subset of runes is to bolster your defenses against various conditions, such as becoming poisoned or getting frenzied. However, in the North American version of the game, none of the detailed descriptions for these runes tells players which resistance is being augmented. That information is only available in the quick description. This is a strange method of presentation, since it means the more detailed full description is actually lacking some important information. Well, as it turns out, that's an issue unique to the US English release, since both the Japanese and the British English versions of these items all include which specific resistance they boost in their full descriptions. This makes the UK English translations for these runes that much more convenient, even if, in a practical sense, I don't think many players go into a rune's full description looking for those kinds of mechanical details. Instead, players are more likely to focus on the lore of the game, and there are some discrepancies between regions here too. For the most part, what this comes down to is which of a handful of opening lines gets used for each rune. This is important because, with the exception of a few runes from the DLC, every Carol rune begins either with a line explaining that it was left by Carol, or a statement that it's a rune which transcribes inhuman sounds. So, for those who are interested in which runes Carol personally discovered, and therefore which runes Byrgenwerth likely had access to in its heyday, this portion of the description is of particular importance. Unfortunately, like with the Kirkhammer, this is a case where all three versions of the game are different, though the UK English list of Carol's runes is considerably closer to the Japanese than the US English one. This is thanks in large part to the fact that the British English version uses the phrase, "a Carol rune that transcribes inhuman sounds," as the initial line in all of the Deep Sea runes, whereas the North American descriptions all open by saying these runes were left by Carol. Since the Japanese uses the inhuman sounds line in each of these cases, that goes a long way to explaining why the US English list of Carol's runes is so much longer than the others. Another interesting thing to note here is that the discrepancies always seem to involve a move away from a rune being directly transcribed by Carol. The Deep Sea runes are ascribed to him in American English, but not British, and this is also the case with the Radiance rune. What's more, in the one case where the opening line of the British English version of a rune is different from the Japanese, it's another instance where the UK English description says Carol left the rune, but the Japanese simply has this as a transcription of inhuman sounds. This would suggest that originally a lot more runes were attributed to Carol, and then that list was pared down over time, with the UK English translation being more up-to-date than the US English one, if not quite as up-to-date as the Japanese. This idea is further borne out by the remaining subtle differences between some of these runes in British as opposed to American English. First of all, there's the relatively minor change in the capitalization of a single word in the description for the Radiance rune. In UK English, the term executioners appears in lowercase, both in the central portion of text and in the final section. This is important because it de-emphasizes the status of the executioners as a proper noun, and therefore as a recognized independent group. In US English, on the other hand, this message is more confused, with executioners being capitalized in the central part of the description, but in lowercase at the end. Now, this could just be the result of better editing on the part of the UK English team, but combined with the altered opening line, I think this reflects a move away from an older conception of how the item fits into the game's lore, which supports the idea of the British English version of the runes being generally more up-to-date than the American English ones. Still, this is some pretty shaky evidence on its own. What I think is more convincing is a discrepancy that can be found in the quick description of the Erden Writhe rune. In this case, the US English version doesn't even identify this as an Erden rune, instead calling it a liaison rune. According to the Bloodborne Lore Translation guide, this seems to line up with a different description for the Erden Writhe rune that was patched out of the North American release after version 1.00, indicating that this was previously known as the liaison rune and fit in differently with the game's lore. Once again, though, the UK English version seems to have always used the more up-to-date full description, and its quick description properly identifies the Erden Writhe rune as an Erden rune even now. But these runes aren't the only indication of how the British English translation includes lore that's closer to the Japanese. There's also the most famous group of items to consider here, the third umbilical cords. Of course, the names of these items are still different across English-speaking regions, with the UK English release being closer to the Japanese in calling them third umbilical cords, as opposed to the American English 1/3 of umbilical cords. But I think the more important thing to focus on to demonstrate that the British English version was generally more up-to-date is how the description of one of the cords in the US English release used to be very different. Back in version 1.00 of the game, North American copies included a reference to how one of these items originated in the child of the Vile Bloods. That wasn't the only difference between the descriptions of the third cords back then as opposed to now, but it was the biggest one, and it only ever existed in the North American versions of the game. Ironically, this is an instance where the US English text being less up-to-date seems to have resulted in extra lore information becoming available to players. Though of course there's always the question of how much weight should be given to text that was patched out of the game. Either way though, the fact that the British English text was more uniform and closer to the Japanese, even back in version 1.00, works as yet more evidence that in general, that version was kept more up to date. Even if, as we've seen with some other items, it doesn't seem to have been quite as up to date as the Japanese text itself. Hopefully, by this point, I've made it clear why I consider this to be the baseline state of affairs. We've just looked at 11 different items where the British English versions have, from the time the game was released, been closer to the latest Japanese text. This has had an impact on the game's lore, as evidenced by several Carol runes and the third umbilical cords. It's meant North American players have had slightly less access to gameplay-relevant information, thanks to a discrepancy in the full descriptions of the Deep Sea runes. And, between the church weapons and the gold pendant, it's meant that British English speakers have gotten better guidance through the game. Altogether, it's enough to make you think that players outside of North America must have had a better experience with the game across the board. However, as I mentioned earlier, that's not actually the case. We've already seen that the US English translation for the gendered attire is better, and when it comes to understanding the game's lore, there are two specific instances where the North American version appears to have always had the edge. Actually, the first of these examples seems like it could be tied in with whatever happened with the translation of the attire, because while most of the differences between the clothing sets have basically no impact on the lore, there is one exception in the case of the Madman garb. This is a specific piece of the Madman set that in the Japanese has a unique ending section that discusses the protective nature of the appendages draped over it. Here, the US English description matches up quite well with the original, while the British English version simply reuses the same text that can be found on the other pieces of the attire in this set. Again, though, this is in keeping with the trend we've already seen in that the North American version of the game seems to have done a better job with the attire. But there's one more item description with a significant lore discrepancy that doesn't fit any of the patterns we've looked at so far. That would be the orphanage key, and the difference here involves the nature of the relationship between the healing church and the choir. In the US English version of the description, the choir is said to have split the healing church, while the UK English instead portrays the group as splitting from the healing church. Obviously, these two interpretations paint a very different picture of the structure of the healing church as it exists in the game, since the wording in the North American release implies the choir is one faction of two remaining in the church, while the British English edition seems to clearly state that the choir has left to form its own organization. Given the importance of this textual discrepancy in understanding the lore of the game, then, I think it's worth looking at the Japanese in some detail to explain why I find the US English interpretation more accurate. In this case, the relevant portion of the description is "kyōkai o nibun suru jōi kaiha," and I think this phrase alone contains some important indicators of which understanding of events is accurate. For one thing, there's the straightforward nature of the verb's relation to its direct object. The verb in question is nibun suru, which can mean either to divide in two or to be divided into, and it's linked via the direct object marker wo to the word kyōkai, or church. In other words, it seems clear that it's the healing church that's being split up. What's more, this short sentence, split the church, is modifying a noun in the Japanese, jōi kaiha, and this noun basically works out to high-level faction. Since factions are, by definition, subsections of larger groups, this indicates that a powerful group within the healing church is being described as dividing the church in two. I would consider this fairly convincing evidence that the choir didn't actually leave the church in its own right. But if we also consider the description of the upper cathedral key, I think things get even clearer. Here, the second line of the Japanese outright says that the healing church is composed of two high-level factions, or jōi kaiha, the School of Mensis and the choir, with both groups being specifically described under the larger category of the church. On the whole, then, I think the Japanese language evidence points to the choir creating division within the church, rather than leaving it, which is more in line with the wording of the US English version of the orphanage key. So, even though there are a lot of cases where the British English translation seems to have been more up-to-date and closer to the Japanese, at least with these two items, the Madman garb and the orphanage key, the North American release has always been more accurate. Essentially, right from the beginning, there's been no definitive version of the game that has best matched the Japanese, and this is something that's only been accentuated over time as various patches have changed the descriptions of certain items. In fact, we've already seen some examples of how updates have brought the North American release both closer to and further away from the latest Japanese. Thinking back to the church weapons, the Kirk hammer seems to have had its text unified using the less accurate translation from its standard version, while the variants for Ludwig's Holy Blade were updated to match its more accurate standard description. However, this sort of confusion is not exclusive to the US English release. The British English versions of the game also have some items that got better with patches and others that got worse. So let's start by looking at some examples of where the UK English release seems to have moved away from the latest Japanese. The clearest evidence of this can be found in the descriptions of the various weapon upgrade materials, and these are an especially interesting set of changes because, at least on the first two, the Bloodstone Shard and the Twin Bloodstone Shard, I actually prefer the formulation of the UK English version even though it's further from the original phrasing. In both Japanese and US English, bloodstones are defined as that which does not crystallize. However, that somewhat literal formulation is potentially confusing. The point is that some substances in blood crystallize after death, becoming blood gems, while others merely harden into blood stones. But while it's possible to piece this together from the phrase, that which does not crystallize becomes a bloodstone, I think the formulation, after death, some substances crystallize, but most simply harden and form bloodstones, does a better job of conveying this idea. It also has the added benefit of specifying that bloodstones are the more common material, something that fits with how blood gems are described as being especially rare. Still, this doesn't change the fact that literally the US English version of the Bloodstone Shards description is closer to the Japanese, and this is something that only becomes more relevant in the case of Bloodstone Chunks. That's because the last part of the Japanese description for the chunks is entirely unique, and there's a slight difference in the opening line as well. At the beginning, the Japanese makes it clear that chunks are more substantial than shards, and in the final section, rather than describe how bloodstones are embedded into weapons to fortify them, it lets players know that only the blood of powerful enemies will form chunks. This information, both at the beginning and the end, is echoed in the US English version, but the relevant parts of the British English description simply reuse the text that appeared on both the Bloodstone Shard and the Twin Bloodstone Shard. The Blood Rock fares better in this regard, since here the UK English and the US English versions are identical from start to finish, but this still makes for a different experience overall. For players of both the US English and the Japanese versions of the game, Bloodstone Chunks and Blood Rocks are set apart from the other Bloodstones by their varied openings and unique closing sections. For players with the British English version of the game, only the Blood Rock is different. In other words, it's a case where an update appears to have moved the UK English release further from the Japanese, to mixed results. As I mentioned earlier though, the British English text has also been improved by updates, and it's these instances I'd like to focus on now. There are two item descriptions in particular where the UK English wording appears to have been changed to bring them more in line with the Japanese, though these updates were not mirrored in their US English equivalents. The first of these instances can be found on Yosefka's Blood Vial. Here, the opening and closing lines were changed to emphasize the fact that the Lady Doctor, Yosefka, is the one responsible for creating this refined blood. This better matches the Japanese when compared to the more detached US English version, which perhaps harkens back to a time when the clinic storyline was different from what it is now. For that matter, the other item with an improved UK English description also seems related to an aspect of the game that changed a lot during development: the story of the doll. The item in question here is the Tear Stone, and the change is that the final line about the naivete of those who consider it to be precious has been removed from the description entirely. Once again, this is a better match for the current Japanese than the American English version, though at least with this item I think the extra line works well with the overall themes of the game. Anyway, while I'm not sure why these changes got patched into the British English edition and not the North American release, it's worth remembering that not all updates represent a step backwards. Instead, things are much more complicated than that, with updates apparently moving both English language versions of the game closer to and further away from the Japanese. It's a confusing state of affairs, though as we've seen, these sorts of mixed results seem to be a common feature of all the discrepancies that appear to have been caused by last-minute updates to the Japanese text. Yes, the UK English version generally seems to have stayed more current than the US English, giving it an edge in terms of guidance through the game, the presentation of mechanical information, and the lore of the world. However, particularly in regards to that last point, the North American release has always had advantages of its own. Taken together, these discrepancies make it so that there's no definitive English language version of the game when it comes to reflecting the latest Japanese text. Which brings me to the very last item on the list, because it actually demonstrates several of these issues at once. Both the US English version and the UK English version of this item have their upsides and downsides when compared to the Japanese text, and these discrepancies appear to be the result of an update. The item is known in the North American edition as the Defiled Chalice, though players of the UK English translation will see it instead as the Cursed and Defiled Chalice. So the name is the first point of discrepancy, and it's also the area where the US English translation is closer to the Japanese. This is plain enough to see, since in Japanese only the term botoku, or defiled, is modifying the word seihai, or chalice, though there may have been some confusion here due to the name of the root chalice for this part of the labyrinth, which does seem to include the word cursed. But the more interesting discrepancy comes where the US English references the Bastard of Loran as opposed to a Bastard of Loran. which is fascinating because it's an example of a situation where the Japanese text actually isn't any help in determining which English language version is more accurate. Since Japanese includes no grammatical articles, and nouns can generally be taken as either singular or plural unless otherwise specified, either one of these interpretations could work as a translation. The only way to properly translate this phrase is to recognize that Bastard of Lorraine is the name of an item, a chalice material that you can obtain in great quantities. Once that's clear, the grammatical phrasing of the US English version will seem misleading, since it makes it sound like there's a single Bastard of Lorraine, and that perhaps the phrase is some kind of title or boss name due to its capitalization. Conversely, the UK English description lets you know that you only need a Bastard of Lorraine, or one thing out of many. Furthermore, the lack of capitalization makes it clear that this isn't some reference to an individual. This is just the sort of thing I would expect to see change in an update, because it only truly makes sense in the full context of the game. It also gets at another reason why the continued updates to the Japanese text seem to have resulted in so much confusion. It's hard enough to get a full idea of the game's story by connecting phrases from item descriptions with other text or dialogue when everything's finalized. When the pieces of that jigsaw puzzle are being recut to fit together in different ways, it only makes things that much more difficult. Really, I think the clearest thing these discrepancies show is how even a highly talented team of translators can struggle because of elements related to the process of video game translation, especially when it comes to coordinating a release across multiple regions. This is perhaps best seen in comparison to the English dialogue for the game, which likely needed to be locked in earlier than the purely text-based descriptions, and where there are no discrepancies between any of these releases. Of course, not every difference between the US and UK English text is due to these sorts of last-minute changes. Some had more to do with being mindful of the way the game handles the names of certain items based on choices made in character creation. Others are actually positive changes introduced as part of the localization process. Still, the biggest issues all seem to arise where the Japanese text received updates that were difficult to coordinate across all languages and regions, meaning I can't help but wonder how things might have turned out if everyone involved, developers and translators alike, had been given a little more time to finalize things. Anyway, that's all for this Translationborne special. I hope you found the topic interesting, and as always, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, I'd love to hear them. Thanks for watching, everyone.